Mother-in-law spiked my drink at family dinner. They say family dinners are supposed to be warm, comforting, and maybe even a little boring. But let me tell you something. Once you've sat at a table where you know one of the people smiling at you just tried to poison you, you'll never think of family dinner the same way again. That night started like any other Sunday at my in-laws' house. A big colonial-style home in the nicest part of town. The kind of place where everything looks polished but feels cold the moment you walk in. I'd been to these dinners dozens of times before, each one leaving me a little more drained. The men would talk stocks and business. The women would compare recipes or gossip about neighbors. And me, I was the odd one out, the photographer. Not a real job, apparently. Not in their world. But this wasn't just another Sunday dinner. It was my mother-in-law's birthday, which meant extra fussing, extra fake smiles, extra judgment packed between slices of roast beef and glasses of wine. By dessert, I was already counting the minutes until we could leave. But then Diane, my mother-in-law, announced she had a surprise. I made a special cocktail for my favorite son-in-law, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She disappeared into the kitchen, humming softly. Something in my gut tightened. I followed, offering to help carry glasses. That's when I saw it, 2 glasses set aside from the rest, one of them with a faint shimmer floating at the top, and Diane, her hand trembling as she slipped a small vial back into her purse. "Oh, Julian, I've got this," she said too brightly, as if my sudden appearance had rattled her. "This one's just for you, my little recipe." She handed me the glass. I stared at it for a second too long, my throat suddenly dry. Then, without missing a beat, I took both glasses in my hands. "Let me help you carry them out," I said calmly. When we sat back at the table, I placed the tampered glass in front of her husband, Gerald, the man who had spent years belittling me, dismissing my career, and calling my work a hobby. He didn't even look up from his phone. He just took the glass, muttered something under his breath, and drank. 45 minutes later, Gerald was pale, sweating, and rushing to the bathroom as violent retching echoed through the house. Diane's face drained of color. Our eyes met across the table, and in that moment, we both knew the truth. She had tried to poison me. And I knew one more thing. I wasn't going to let this go. My name is Julian Mercer. I'm 32 years old, an independent photographer based in Asheville, North Carolina. I've built my business from the ground up: weddings that paid the bills, wildlife photography that fueled my soul, magazine spreads that gave me credibility. But for Diane and Gerald, my in-laws, none of it mattered. To them, a man wasn't measured by passion, creativity, or impact. No. Their currency was square footage, corner offices, and company cars. Gerald was an investment banker, the kind of man who saw the world in numbers and status symbols. Diane, his wife, mirrored that worldview with her own sharp-edged elegance. From the very beginning, I knew I didn't fit their definition of good enough for their daughter, Haley. I met Haley 6 years ago at an art exhibition where my work was on display. She was finishing her master's degree in environmental science, her eyes lighting up as she spoke about ecosystems, conservation, and protecting the fragile beauty of the natural world. We were drawn to each other instantly. Her passion complemented mine. Her grounded intellect balanced my restless creativity. We fell in love quickly, the kind of love that feels like oxygen, the kind you don't just stumble upon twice in a lifetime. But love stories rarely exist in a vacuum. They exist in the messy web of family, history, and expectation. And that's where the trouble began. From our very first dinner together, Gerald made his disapproval clear. "So, you're the photographer," he said, as if announcing my profession like a disappointing diagnosis. "How's the little hobby treating you?" Haley squeezed my hand under the table, an apology written in her eyes. But Gerald kept pressing, his tone dripping with disdain. Diane was subtler. She'd compliment my work, but always with a twist. "Your photos are beautiful. Julian, But don't you think it's time to settle into something stable, something reliable over the years? I tried. I really did. I brought expensive bottles of wine to their dinners, casually mentioned my high-profile clients, shared magazine features, but nothing changed in their eyes. I wasn't the kind of man who could provide real security for their daughter. Last Christmas, I overheard Diane on the phone. Haley could have married Thomas, orthopedic surgeon, family money, but she chose the creative one. She spat out the word creative like it was a disease. Gerald was more direct. When Haley and I told them we were trying for a baby, he pulled me aside and said, "Children are expensive. Son, maybe think about real employment before you bring one into the world." I never told Haley about those moments. She loved her parents, despite their flaws, and I didn't want to force her into choosing sides. So I smiled through their backhanded comments, complimented Diane's cooking, and shook Gerald's hand firmly each time. But beneath the surface, their disapproval grew like mold in the walls, silent, creeping, toxic. And that night at the birthday dinner, it finally broke through. When Gerald collapsed in the bathroom, Diane rushed after him, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood floors. Haley was panicked, running to get water. Owen was calling an ambulance, and I just sat there, calm, watching, because I knew what had happened and I wanted her to know that I knew. When Gerald returned, pale and trembling, Diane blamed the seafood. "It must have been bad shellfish," she stammered, her voice too high, her eyes flicking to me, then away. I excused myself, taking the untouched glass back into the kitchen. My hands shook as I poured it into a small container I'd slipped into my bag earlier, a reflex from years of photographing the unexpected. You don't grow up with a camera in your hands without learning how to anticipate moments, how to be prepared. The glass went into my bag. The plan began forming in my head. That night, as Haley fussed over her father and Diane refused to meet my eyes, I decided I wouldn't confront her directly, not yet. No yelling across the dinner table. No accusations she could brush off as paranoia. No, I'd do it differently, methodically. Because if I'd learned anything from photography, it's that the truth is best revealed through evidence. The following Monday, I drove straight to the lab of a former client, Jason, a toxicologist I'd once photographed for a science magazine profile. I handed him the container. "Family matter," I said when he raised an eyebrow. 3 days later, he called. "Julianne, there were benzodiazepines in that drink. Enough to knock someone out for hours, maybe cause memory loss. Where did you get this?" I thanked him, asked for a written report, and didn't answer his question. From there, I dug deeper. I discovered Diane had prescriptions from multiple doctors, overlapping, suspicious. She'd been doubling and tripling doses. And when I spoke quietly to people in town, the stories emerged: Diane acting strangely at parties, accusations of jewelry theft at her country club, whispered rumors her family had paid to bury. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed. But I needed more than suspicion. I needed undeniable proof. And that came from the last place I expected: Vanessa, my brother-in-law's wife. She handed me a USB drive one evening. "You should see this," she whispered. On it, home security footage, time-stamped from the night of the dinner. Diane in the kitchen, clearly pouring something into a drink. Me walking in, Gerald drinking. Then later, footage of Diane screaming at Gerald for drinking the wrong glass. It wasn't just evidence, it was a confession. On video. And suddenly, this wasn't just about me, this was about Haley. Because the next video showed Diane plotting with Gerald to sabotage our marriage, just as they'd sabotaged Haley's relationships before me. It turns out I wasn't the first. Haley had once been engaged, years before we met, a man named Thomas, by all accounts. Kind, intelligent, steady. But Gerald and Diane didn't approve. They planted evidence, whispered lies, and convinced her he was unfaithful. She broke it off in tears, never realizing she'd been manipulated. When I spoke to Thomas, he confirmed it all. showed me old emails, desperate attempts to explain, ignored by a woman already conditioned to distrust. It was a pattern. Anyone who encouraged Hailey's independence was pushed out. Any relationship that didn't fit her parents' vision was destroyed. And now, it was my turn. But this time, I had proof. I gathered everything: the toxicology report, the prescriptions, the footage, the testimonies. Then I invited Owen and Vanessa over for dinner. Hailey sat beside me. Unaware of what I was about to reveal, I connected my laptop to the TV. And for the next hour, we watched it all: the poisoning, the arguments, the manipulations. Owen muttered, "That's not my parents," shaking his head. Vanessa placed a hand on his arm. Tears in her eyes. Hailey sat frozen, her face pale. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she whispered. "Because you needed to see for yourself," I said softly. That night, the truth broke something open. Hailey cried. Owen raged. Vanessa finally confessed how they tried to sabotage her too, until the birth of her child gave her leverage. And for the first time, the mask slipped. Diane and Gerald weren't just overbearing parents. They were master manipulators, willing to poison, lie, and gaslight to maintain control. But revelations don't heal overnight. For weeks, Hailey barely spoke to me. She visited her parents alone, returned with red eyes. She was torn between the family who raised her and the man who loved her, between the lies she'd been fed for years and the truth now staring her in the face. Diane and Gerald tried to spin it. They told her I'd fabricated the footage, that I was insecure, manipulative, unstable. They planted seeds of doubt. And for a while, I feared those seeds would take root. But then Hailey looked at me one night, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I believe you," she whispered, "and I'm sorry I doubted." It wasn't victory, but it was enough. 6 months passed. Hailey and Owen began therapy, untangling the knots their parents had tied in their minds. Diane and Gerald kept their distance, texting occasionally, but respecting the new boundaries. I opened my own gallery downtown. At the opening, Hailey stood beside me, radiant, a hand resting on her pregnant belly. Gerald and Diane arrived briefly, offered stiff congratulations, then left, and for the first time, I realized I had won, not by fighting their game, not by screaming or stooping to manipulation, but by living well, on my own terms, with the woman I loved. When I look back, the lesson is clear. Sometimes, poison doesn't come in a glass. It comes in whispered doubts, backhanded comments, and conditional love. It comes from people who claim to care for you but secretly undermine everything you are. And when you face that kind of poison, the only antidote is truth, documentation, boundaries. But most of all, the courage to define your worth by your own standards, not theirs. That's what I did. And in the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all.